And when we ended 2 weeks ago, we were looking at John chapter 18, verse 28 through the first part of verse 38. And you'll recall that in the early morning, Jesus was led from Caiaphas' house to the headquarters and residence of the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. And though it's unreported by John, the Jews, after some initial waffling where Pilate wanted to know, well, what's the accusation you're bringing in? They say, in essence, hey, if he hadn't done something, we wouldn't have brought him to you. But after some resistance there, they had represented to Pilate that Jesus was a rival to Caesar, that he was the king of the Jews in a political sense, and therefore was guilty of treason. So when Pilate asked Jesus in verse 33, "Are you the king of the Jews?" he's asking if he is the political threat that the Jews had represented him to be. And Jesus asked Pilate, he asked him if that was his idea. In other words, if that was a conclusion he had reached based on his own investigation and assessment of the facts, or whether that was how the Jews had portrayed him to Pilate in order to have him executed. So he asked that question to Pilate, which gets him thinking, and that, along with the Jews' initial balking at delivering a charge or an accusation of a violation of Roman law, those things make Pilate suspect that the Jews really want Jesus killed for some religious reason. They want him killed for a religious reason, and they're claiming that he's a political king who threatens Caesar simply to have Pilate do their dirty work. So Pilate's not stupid. He knows the world, and he knows how people operate, and he knows how politics works and power stuff. And so he's suspecting that there's something going on here. And that's what prompts him, his response to Jesus in verse 35, which is where we left off. See, Pilate makes clear that he does not care about Jewish disagreements that are purely religious. He has no interest in that, and that's what's behind his statement, "Am I a Jew?" Those kinds of things are only of interest to Jews. Your internal religious stuff, I don't care about. Okay? Am I a Jew? Now, the fact is that Jesus' own people had handed him over. And Pilate wants to know the nature of any conduct Jesus may have engaged in that caused them to hand him over, because he wants to know, is there a Roman crime here? That's his only interest. That's what he wants to know. So he says, "What have you done?" I want to know, is there anything here? They're the ones that delivered you over to me. What have you done? And since the essence of the attack that is made on Jesus by his accusers is that he's a political threat, he represents a threat to the Roman Empire, a challenge to Caesar. Well, Jesus explains that that's not the case. He says his kingdom is not of this world. Not meaning that it has nothing to do with the physical world, but meaning that his kingdom does not originate or derive from this world. See, we sometimes, my kingdom's not of this world, and then we talk about a new heavens and new. No, that's not his kingdom. His kingdom's off in the ethereal heavens or something. That's not what he's talking about. It doesn't originate or derive from this world. Colin Cruz, in his commentary, says, his kingdom is given by God, not established by human struggle. His kingdom is active in this world and will one day come with power. But its power is not of this world. It is of God. You see, Christ's kingdom, the kingdom he's speaking about, it's not a nation or a state or a movement that imposes its will by force, as indicated by the fact that his servants did not fight to prevent his arrest. He's saying, see, if the kind of kingdom you're asking. If my kingdom was that kind, well, then my servants would have gone to war. We would have done that kind of thing. So it doesn't threaten the empire because his nation isn't that kind that will impose its will by force. It doesn't threaten the Roman Empire in any conventional sense. You see, it's going to redo everything. But it doesn't threaten the empire in a conventional political sense that I'm going to come in force and be an opposing political power. So that's what motivates what he's saying. And then Pilate picks up on Jesus' reference to my kingdom. And he says to him, so you were a king? Right? He says, so you were a king. And Jesus says, you say that I am a king. Now that's one of these ways of phrasing something that means, well, that's correct. When you say I'm a king, and that kind of way of putting it, you see, is to say, well, yes, that's correct when it's understood properly. Yes, I am a king, but, not in the way you may be conceiving it. There's more to it than that. And then he proceeds, he tells him, he says, he was born and came into, what about this king? Why are you qualifying it? Why aren't you? Well, when you look at it, he says his purpose was he was born and came into this world for the purpose of testifying to the truth. So he comes into this world on a mission. And he comes in for the purpose of testifying to the truth of God's work in this world and Jesus' role in that work. So he's telling him, you see, I have come here for a purpose, to testify to the truth of God's work in this world and my role there. And he says that everyone who is of the truth, everyone who values and desires the truth, listens to his voice, listens to his testimony that he is revealing now, having come into this world from eternal heavenly glory to testify to the truth of God. Everyone who's of the truth listens to his voice. And he is in essence, or in effect, asking Pilate if he is of the truth, if he will listen to his voice. And Pilate reveals that he's not of the truth, that he does not listen to Jesus' voice. By his cynical response, what is truth? You see, so he's not on the side of truth. He's too cynical. What is truth? He implies that truth is beyond knowing, and thereby he consigns himself to the rejection of truth. Truth, who knows how are you going to get at it? I mean, okay, so he's not on the side of the truth. He doesn't listen to Jesus. He implicitly rejects the truth. And then we see in 1838, second part of that verse through 1912. After he'd said this, Pilate, went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? They cried out again, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber, an insurrectionist. And he says, then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, See, I'm bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man! When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. Uh-oh. It says, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "Will you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." By the way, greater sin, you see, not all sin is equal for all purposes. All sin will separate you from God, but there are degrees of sin, despite how much you hear the contrary. Okay? There are greater sins. All right? So he says here, from then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." J. Ramsey Michaels, in his commentary, he says, nothing Jesus has said about his kingship has convinced Pilate to regard him as a criminal or in any way a threat to the empire. So he sees no basis for any of this crucifixion of Jesus at all. And Pilate goes out and he tells the Jews that he finds no cause, meaning he finds no grounds for proceeding against Jesus. There's nothing there. I understand you want him executed, but there's absolutely nothing there. But hoping to mitigate his responsibility, see, for not delivering what the Jews wanted him to deliver, for not crucifying him, he appeals to the crowd. And he mentions the custom under which he releases one prisoner at the time of the Passover. See, he asks if they want him to release the King of the Jews. See, which would then put the responsibility on him. He's getting pressured from the Jews to execute Jesus. He says there's nothing here. There's no grounds to execute him. He doesn't want to execute him. So he's looking for a way to not execute him that will let him off the hook to some extent with the Jews. So he goes to the people. And he says, "You guys, I released one at Passover. You want me to release the King of the Jews, right?" And then that would satisfy him, and he could turn to the Jews and say, "Hey, what do you want me to do? It was up to your people, and they said for me to release him, so I went along with what they wanted." You see, so he's looking for a way politically to get him off the hook with the Jews who are pushing him to do something that he doesn't want to do. But the crowd, you see, persuaded by the chief priests and the elders, which John doesn't report, but we see in Matthew 27:20 and in Mark 15:11, they ask him to release a robber or an insurrectionist, this man named Barabbas, about whom nothing is known except what is reported in the Gospels. So they have been persuaded by the Jewish leaders, ask for Barabbas, ask for Barabbas. Okay? So this is what they wind up doing. Now Pilate, he had Jesus flogged. Okay, which here it almost certainly refers to the relatively mild flogging that was meted out for minor offenses. What the Romans called fustigatio. You remember many years ago, I don't remember if he was a vandal or something, but there was a kid in Singapore who was caned. It was a big news story, but I'm old, so I don't know how, when you're old, you look back and you say, yeah, that was not too long ago, and it'll be like, no, that was 30 years ago. Hey, I don't remember how long ago it was, but so that they had this fustigatio was this flogging that was relatively mild, that was meted out for minor offenses, as distinct from the terrible scourging that is associated with crucifixion, the scourging that is known as verberatio. Okay, so they had a relatively mild flogging, fustigatio, But then they had this horrible scourging that was connected to part of the sentence of crucifixion that was verberatio. And the beatings of the verberatio, they were so savage that the victims sometimes died just from the beating, where they would whip you, with the thongs, with the bone and material in there. And that would just take the flesh off your back. See, Pilate has not yet sentenced Jesus to be crucified. That doesn't come until verse 16. He's still declaring that he finds no cause against him. See, they want him to do that, but he's still saying, I find no basis, no cause for crucifying him, you see in verses 4 and 6. As D.A. Carson comments in his commentary, he says, it's hard to imagine any Roman prefect administering the verberatio before sentencing. Okay, before he's been sentenced to be crucified. So I think this is this flognus fustigatio that he gives to him. Pilate, his conduct here is in line with his intention, as stated in Luke chapter 23, verse 22, I will therefore punish and release him. That's what's going on here. You see, he's going to punish him like that. And as part of the attempt to placate the rage of the Jewish accusers, Jesus is humiliated. He's humiliated for claiming that he is the king, of course the Messiah, but claiming that he's the king of the Jews, and a crown of thorns is put on his head, and he's draped in a purple robe, purple being the color of royalty. So they have some trashy kind of robe that's purplish, and they throw it on him, mocking him. A crown of thorns. Oh, he's the king. And this is what they're doing. So they do that, and they mock him as the king of the Jews, and they slap him. And see, Pilate is having this done in the hope that this will be sufficient to satisfy the Jewish lust for his blood. That when they see him humiliated to this extent with regard to claims of kingship, just treated as a nothing, that they'll then back off and go, all right, that's good enough. That's what he's hoping. And so Pilate displays him. He brings out the battered, bruised, beaten, and dressed up Jesus like a clown show. Just degrading, humiliating. He brings him out. You see, he has no power. Look how we're able to treat him. Hoping that will get them to say, okay, that's enough. And so he brings him out like that, this battered and dressed up Jesus, and he tells them, look at him. Just look at him. You see how humiliated and degraded he is. And as I say, he hopes that they'll take this as sufficient vindication of their outrage toward him, that will then placate them and they'll say, okay. But that's not what happens, right? They just shout, crucify him! Crucify him! There's no, you're not going to do anything with these people. They are bent on having him killed. And Pilate's response in the second part of verse 6, it's best understood, I think, along the lines of, look, if you're so bent on crucifying him, you're going to have to do it, because I'm not doing it, because I find no guilt in him. There is no basis for me to crucify him. I'm not going to do it. So you're the ones who are so hepped up on crucifying him. If you want to do it, you go ahead and do it. Oh yeah, and by the way, you know that you have no legal authority to crucify him. So go ahead. But if you do, you know you're going to pay the penalty for doing it. But it's a way of saying, I find, you guys are also, you're just, lusting to crucify him. Well, then you do it. But you can't do it, can you? Because the Romans took from the Jews the right to administer the death penalty formally Okay, you can have riots and stuff like that, and if the Romans chose to look the other way because it didn't cause too much trouble, you got the stoning of Stephen, those. But there was no legal process by which the Jews could sentence someone to death, because the Romans, when they occupied them, took that power away from them. The only power to execute formally or to administer formally the death penalty rested with Rome. So he's saying, listen, I find no basis on it. If you want him crucified, you're going to have to do it, and you can't do it. Okay? So if you want to do it, and you're going to wind up paying the penalty for it. The note to the New English translation, it says, although a few scholars have suggested that the situation was at this point so far out of Pilate's control that he really was telling the high priest they could go ahead and crucify a man he had found to be innocent. This seems unlikely. Okay? It is far more likely that Pilate's statement should be understood as one of frustration and perhaps sarcasm. Hey, you want him crucified? You go ahead and do it. Oh, yeah, I forgot. You can't do it, can you? You can't do it. I'm the only one who can do it. And I'm telling you, I'm not doing it because I find no guilt in him. He goes on and says, this seems to be supported by the context, for the Jewish authorities make no attempt at this point to seize Jesus and crucify him. Rather, they continue to pester Pilate to order the crucifixion. And I think that's in fact what's going on. Now, the Jews let on why they're so insistent that Jesus be put to death. And they say their law demands his execution because he claimed to be the Son of God. We've had this talk about he's king of Israel, political threat. Now they slide out this thing because he claimed to be the Son of God. Ooh. Leon Morris says, law clearly refers to the law of blasphemy. By this law, they say, Jesus ought to die because he has made himself Son of God. Now, that's what they say. Now, that Jesus claimed to be divine. So they're reporting to Pilate, this guy who you have in your clutches, the guy we've delivered over to you, he's got to go because he claimed to be the Son of God. Now it says here, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He's concerned that there might be something to this. As Leon Morris in his commentary, he says, Pilate was evidently superstitious. He's certainly not a religious person, right? He could scarcely be called a religious man. But the news that his prisoner had made divine claims, as reported to him from the Jewish accusers, scared the governor. His fear cannot be fear of the Jews. It must be fear connected with Jesus in some way. He had possibly been affected by a message from his wife about a dream she had had. You remember in Matthew 27:19. Hey, don't have anything to do with this guy. I was greatly disturbed. And now this guy claims to be the Son of God. And Pilate's going, And every Roman knew of stories of the gods or their offspring appearing in human guise. Divine men were part of the first century understanding of life. Pilate had plainly been impressed by Jesus as he talked. Jesus was certainly a curious fellow, right? He's interacting with him. In this situation and circumstance, he knows all about people and humans and how they act. And this guy, Jesus, there's just something about him. Now we're going to add that now, wait a minute, now you're telling me somebody said he's the Son of God? My wife's telling me this? All right. He says now he hears of the possibility of the supernatural. He's profoundly affected. And so Pilate goes back to Jesus now and he says, hey man, where are you from? I need some deets. You know, I want some more info here because I want to know where you're from. I want to try to drill down on this and see if what's going on with this claim of divine nature. And for whatever reason, whether Pilate's preconceptions would have prevented him from understanding the answer, or whether the answer had already in effect been given, in verse 37, Jesus doesn't respond. And Pilate tells him in so many words that his life is in Pilate's hands. That's what he tells him. I have the authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you. You see, so the implication is, therefore, it would behoove you to cooperate with me and respond to my inquiries. You see, so this is what he's saying here. And Jesus tells him that his, Pilate's, authority over him ultimately comes from God. Right? The implication being that there's more going on here, Pilate, than you recognize. I know you're this guy, you got all this, but you think, hey, I'm the kingpin. I do what I want. I'm the authority. And Jesus is simply telling him, it's more complicated. It's deeper. There's more going on that you simply don't recognize, right? Your authority, whatever that authority is over me, was given to you by somebody who's way over you. You see, way over you. He can do to Jesus only what the Father allows him to do. See, he's acting like he has complete control, plenary power, that he's sovereign in the matter. And it's simply not true. Gary Burge, in his commentary, says, no one can take the Son's life away from him. No one. God has permitted Pilate to have this power over Jesus because it is a necessary aspect of what will happen in the hour. Jesus must die. Now, the logic of the second part of verse 11, it's not really clear, right? I mean, he says, Jesus answered him, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. You're going, exactly what's going on here? How does that flow out of what he just said? And I think the logic is along the following lines. Because God is the source of all human authority, as exemplified in Pilate's authority, because God's the source of all human authority, all humans are answerable to God for their conduct in positions of authority and in terms of their stewardship of the authority that God had given to them. The one who delivered Jesus over to Pilate, presumably Caiaphas, was guilty of greater sin than Pilate, because Pilate wasn't acting against Jesus out of deliberate hatred or calculated malice like Caiaphas was. So I think that's the logic of what's going on there. And then Pilate, he wants to release Jesus. That's what he said. He sought to release him. He's looked at him. He says, I find no basis. There's no grounds for executing him. He wants to release him, but he lacks the will or the determination to do so without the acquiescence of the Jews. He wants to do it, but he's afraid to do it without their consent or their acquiescence because he's concerned of the trouble they can cause for him. That's what it boils down to. And the Jews tell Pilate that, look, if you release him, we want him dead, we understand you don't. But listen to us, Pilate. If you do not do what we want, if you release him, you are not a friend of Caesar. So they make clear, you see, that their position, if he does that, their position before his superiors, their position before the Roman authorities is going to be that Jesus claimed to be a king and therefore set himself in opposition to Caesar. In other words, they are going to paint Jesus as a political revolutionary that they gift wrapped and gave to Pilate, and he cut him loose. Now, that's not good on your resume in the Roman administration. Okay, that you had somebody here who was an enemy of the empire, a revolutionary, delivered to you by your very good subjects, and then you blew him off and let him go. So they're threatening Pilate. And isn't this just perfect politics? Isn't this how people work? And you see that they're doing that. So then 19 verses 13 to 16. So when Pilate heard these words, he knows the score. When he heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and at Aramaic Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to be crucified. Pilate judged. He's already admitted. He said, look, there's no grounds for executing him. Out of his own mouth. But he judged that Jesus' life was not worth the trouble that the Jews could cause him by claiming he had released a political revolutionary. So he simply calculates. I know the guy is not worthy of death. I know that. I know that they're pressing me and manipulating me. But my life's going to be a lot easier if I just have this guy killed. And that's how it is. And I hate to say that's just, politicians from time immemorial do corrupt and awful things because they're politicians. And this is this guy here doing this. Now, the day of preparation, he brings him out to the location at which official judgments were rendered. Okay, so this is the spot where the case is formally adjudicated, where the sentence is pronounced. And he brings him out to that spot. And the day of preparation of the Passover, it refers not to Thursday. Okay, so you remember Nisan 15 fell on a Friday. That's the actual Passover meal. Now, there is a preparation for the Passover meal. But this preparation day refers to the day of preparation for the Sabbath. It's Friday. It's the day of preparation. And it's the day of the preparation here of the Sabbath that falls during the Passover week, which this year happened to fall the very next day. Okay, so he's not talking about Thursday when the Passover lamb would be slain for the Passover meal on Nisan 15. He's talking about the day before the Jewish Sabbath. All right, and we'll see that quite clearly in a bit. So now John says here in verse 14, it was about the 6th hour. Where you may recall that in Mark chapter 15, verse 25, it says, it was the 3rd hour when they crucified him. So naturally, skeptics have, and maybe rightly, jumped on this and said, isn't this a contradiction? And I think there are different ways of handling this. But I think the most likely way of harmonizing this seeming discrepancy is that the time references are really broad approximations of the sun's position in the sky, the boundaries of which are imprecise. First century Jews were not nearly as time conscious as Westerners are. Like you and I think this way. We think 7, 8, 9. We have watches. We've always had watches, and now phones. They weren't like that. And so you have from sunrise to sunset, it's divided into 12 hours as you see in John 11:9. But that span of light from sunrise to sunset, it had three main reference points: the third hour, the sixth hour, and the ninth hour. Okay? Those reference points. And you can see those same reference points in the parable in Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 9. They function, you see, as shorthand for mid-morning, midday, and mid-afternoon. They are not to be viewed the way we do, as precisely in our clockness, 9, 12, and 3. You see, it's more like mid-morning, midday, mid-afternoon. Those are just general reference points for that. And so with that understanding, you see that when you look at it that way, if Jesus was crucified somewhere near the transition from mid-morning to midday, you see there's an awful lot of vagueness in there. If he was crucified somewhere in that time, let's say 10:30, it could fairly be described both as mid-morning, the third hour, and as about midday, the sixth hour. Right? I think that would be reasonable. And John may have opted, he may have put it in terms of about midday because he wanted to highlight the length of the proceedings to which Jesus had been subjected. So maybe, in other words, he's going on that end of it, so people will get the sense of, look at all he's had to endure before. Okay, so maybe. Now, here are a couple of articles online if you want to chase this some more. Justin Taylor, you'll have to just Google these, but Justin Taylor, you put in his name, and this article, you ask, what time did Jesus die? And he will present to you pretty much what I've just said to you. But there are some other ideas, and for those you can look at James Davis, and it's the time of Jesus' death and inerrancy. Is harmonization possible? So if you're troubled by this, curious about it, want to just chase down some other things, you can have a look at those. But Pilate, you see, Pilate's now chapped. He's irritated that these Jews are flexing on him. You see, he's made clear he doesn't find it, he doesn't want to do this, but they're pressuring him. They're making him do what they want in a power play. And he's not really happy about it. He tells them, behold your king. And they insist that he be crucified, and then Pilate jabs them again, saying, so should I crucify your king? Now he knows that they're saying, look, he only claimed to be king. But he's saying, no, he's your king. Should I kill your king? Oh, you great Jewish leaders, you see this guy? Look at him. That's your king. Isn't that right? Isn't that what you're telling me? And so he's jabbing him that way. And the chief priests tell Pilate, we have no king but Caesar. And they tell him that because they want to keep the pressure on Pilate that Jesus is opposed to Caesar. He's opposed to Caesar, and therefore he's someone that Pilate must execute. Right? Should I do your king? Hey, not our king, baby. We only have one king, Caesar. So if you're saying this guy's a king, then he's opposed to Caesar, and therefore you're obligated to kill him. So they're keeping the pressure on him like that. But in saying that, right, they make a very damning confession. They make a very damning confession. They have rejected God as the true king of Israel, a truth reflected in their rejection of his son, the Messiah. Ooh, they said a lot. A lot of times people say things not really appreciating the truth that they're uttering. As John said in chapter 1, verse 11, he came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Here are the Jews insisting before Pilate, who's bent on letting him go, he's not going. We are going to be sure that he is executed, and we will do absolutely everything necessary to see that that happens. So Pilate hands him over to be crucified, gave him over to the psychos who will administer the crucifixion. All right, I'll read 19:16, second part of verse 16 through 37. It's 4.5 slides, I think. And then I know that bell. I heard that first one, so it's just lurking for me. It's waiting. It's just sitting there going, all right, but let's read it anyway. And I don't know. I'll decide next week if I need to read it again. So they took Jesus and he went out, bearing his own cross, which was standard, to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. And it was written in Aramaic, in Latin, and in Greek. So the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but rather this man said, 'I am King of the Jews.' Don't say he's the King of the Jews, say he only claimed it." Pilate answered, "What I've written, I've written." Pilate is in no mood to make any accommodation for these people now, after the way they've messed with him. All right, he says, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and divided them into 4 parts, 1 part for each soldier. Also his tunic, but the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be." This was to fulfill the scripture which says, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." So the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother, let me finish reading this and I'll shut up. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman." And you just think of this. This guy who's been scourged and gone through all he's gone through, hanging on a cross, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her to his home. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said to fulfill scripture, "I thirst." A jar full of sour wine stood there. So they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it up to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Since it was a day of preparation, you see it's preparation before the Sabbath. Since it was a day of preparation so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, meaning it was the Sabbath during the Passover week. It was a special Sabbath. He says the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it, baby, has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, that you also may believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled, not one of his bones be broken. And again, another scripture says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. A lot there. Thanks for hanging in.